August 7, 1942, 0630, Shore Red Beach, Tilagi sector. The surge and roar of the guns at sea announced the arrival of the landing force, but the real war, as often happens, turned out not to be on the sand. The real enemy was another, not a man, but space itself. The dense, viscous jungles of the Solomon Islands, which the Japanese command called Green Hell. The Japanese prepared their fortifications, built perimeters, stockpiled supplies. They were counting on a classical defense against a direct attack, were ready to die for the emperor, yet they did not expect to die from hunger, fever, and exhaustion. The American strategy, born of despair and practical calculation, trembled in consciousness and turned the jungle into a weapon, a surgical siege, an approach that fundamentally changed the war in the tropics. The South Pacific defensive doctrine of the Japanese, developed over years, was based on the idea of complete self-sufficiency and rigid defense. Having captured the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, they regarded the chain of the Solomon Islands as a reliable shield of their empire. One of such large wooded island points, which in the text is called Kamoshima, the island of the gods, was chosen as the key stronghold where the most important airfield was located. In the text, Khiton, for dramaturgy also called Eagle/Henderson Field. General Tsurda, in the text Shagakazutsu Tsurda, commanded the defense of Kamoshima and devised a scheme that was supposed to thwart the American island-hopping campaign. He concluded that the enemy's weak points were speed and logistics, and therefore it was necessary to allow the landing to take place, but make every meter of advance cost the invaders thousands of lives. He did not hold the beaches. The basis of his defense became a web. 25,000 men occupied belts of interlaced trenches only 20 meters apart, and systems of natural karst caves to drive American columns into deadly crossfires. The construction was merciless and costly. About 6,000 men of the garrison worked only on creating and strengthening underground positions. Inside the jungle, the temperature in the ravines reached unimaginable numbers. The humidity was such that digging had to be done with frequent stops to avoid heat stroke. The cave systems ranged from narrow, two-man foxholes to huge command centers accommodating up to 500 people. The fortifications had concrete nests with roofs several feet thick. The Japanese expected to withstand the fire. They believed that the dense rock and green canopy would protect them both from shells and tanks. They staked everything on the belief that dense fortifications would hold the assault, and that the Americans would have to pay for every spadeful ahead. But they miscalculated. They were preparing for a war of metal and bullets, but faced a strategy that used their self-sufficiency against themselves. They expected a physical clash of arms, but encountered a war of time, disease, and starvation. The United States, faced with the impossibility of storming the jungle with minimal losses, developed a method that did not break the defense by force, but exhausted it. This strategy was called Operation Anvil. Not a weapon in the traditional sense, but an intellectual device, a precise, merciless blockade of supply, which in the end turned nature and logistics into executors of the sentence. When the first American units, in the text these units are called the 10th Marine Regiment, encountered the Japanese lines around the airfield, Eagle-Henderson, losses quickly increased. A direct attack was suicidal, therefore a radical decision was made to expend the advantage of fleet and air power not on a breakthrough, but on complete isolation of the island, and depriving the enemy of access to water, food, and medicines. To achieve this, a synergy was created between naval forces, logistics, and medicine. In the text, this is NSIC, Naval Supply and Interdiction Command, and GWS, Geological Warfare Service. Commodore Finch, in the text Alistair Finch, proposed to use the superiority of the fleet not for landing, but for strangling supply lines. The task was not so much to sink ships as to force the Japanese to dump or throw overboard heavy and bulky supplies: rice, water purification tablets, medical stores, valuables that lose meaning when delivered in fragments. The concept was based on 7 principles of Anvil. First, unending dominance in the air. Second, logistical inversion, calculating how many dry rations, medicines, and ammunition the garrison needed per week. Over time, while American ships controlled the narrow supply corridors, in the text Tokyo Express, the fast Japanese shuttle deliveries, the Japanese were forced to use vulnerable high-speed boats that carried only small batches, poorly suited for supplying a large garrison. This was not so much the sinking of ships as forcing them to abandon part of their cargo to avoid bombing. Through these methods, the Americans achieved that the Japanese troops ended up on a ration that did not allow maintaining combat capability. According to NSIC's calculations, 3 months of limited supplies would bring the garrison to a state of severe medical incapacity. GWS and specialists in geology and disease documented that this ecosystem produced particularly dangerous forms of malaria and severe dysentery, diseases capable of immobilizing a man within days, especially without specialized drugs such as quinine. The American focus was not on trying to destroy people directly, but on cutting off their access to specific medicines and sanitation. Aircraft patrols and submarine missions targeted coastal depots and sites where medical kits were stored, not the soldiers themselves. The tactical content of Anvil lay in creating a closed ring around the airfield and its immediate surroundings. Ground forces were arrayed in containment, holding the perimeter and not storming the deep defense. They patrolled the borders and drove the Japanese out of fortifications with hunger and disease. It meant not so much destroying fortifications by masses of infantry, but increasing the enemy's exhaustion. Every forced sortie beyond the protected zone cost the Japanese energy and calories, accelerated the consumption of their internal reserves. The main idea: the Americans had endless supply, the Japanese did not. The goal was not to shoot, but to let the jungle do its work. Months passed, and tactical changes became visible in reports. Fortified positions that had been held were now abandoned. There they found untouched belongings, food, and personal items. People simply left their strongholds in search of water and food. Radio intercepts documented growing desperation in Japanese messages. Pleased to deliver water and doctors, reports of high fevers, mass dysentery. There were requests to evacuate non-combatant soldiers and even mentions that fighters were asking for medicines or permission to use crude survival methods. In descriptions of the operation appears terminology that sounds harsh and cold: weaponization of jungle disease, the use of the jungle as a defeat factor. It implied that the Americans acted methodically. Patrols destroyed available water sources and supplies outside the main fortifications to block access to key resources. This was not destruction for the sake of ruin, but a column of calculation. Block, intercept, wait. Calculations presented in the documents showed that under 3 months of blockade, most of the garrison would become medically unfit, due to weakness, disease, and lack of calories. By October, the situation had become dramatic. Patrols began to notice that many fortifications were empty. Japanese soldiers gathered at temporary water sources, desperately searching for food. Radio intercepts recorded the despair of the command, requests for urgent transfer of medical units, reports of fever outbreaks above 40 degrees Celsius, requests for clean water, statements that dysentery affected up to half of the units. Commanders asked for permission to evacuate inner positions when they became uninhabitable. The commanders wrote in despair, "Our enemy is not the Marines. Our enemy is the terrain and nature." At this time, the Americans moved to gradual reduction of positions, small numbers, fast raids, aimed not at direct combat, but at destroying outer supply points and preventing the Japanese from maintaining even the smallest water depots. By this, they achieved that the Japanese were forced to waste calories in vain on movement, searching, maintaining readiness, and eventually physical reserves were exhausted. What had once represented a war of iron and artillery now turned into arithmetic. Whoever had more supplies lived. In February 1943, 178 days after the start of operations, the psychological breakdown became completely evident. Sinister messages began to arrive from the territory. The wounded and sick demanded medical help. Pleas for clean water were heard. Orders contained the words dysentery, cannot maintain duty, ammunition secondary. After months of exhaustion, many defensive nodes became non-conductive. Men abandoned positions not because of battle, but because battle had become physically impossible. This was the first documented evidence that defense collapsed from physiological necessity, not tactical defeat. American patrols used a new technique. They searched for signs of recent activity, abandoned firing points, excrement, traces of eating, and left at cave entrances bait in the form of food, sometimes sweetened or laxative canned goods, not for poisoning, which would violate the laws of war, but to accelerate the effects of the already emerging diseases and thereby temporarily disable the garrisons. Reports noted that starving Japanese, having no other hope, ate what was offered, and the ensuing episodes of vomiting and dehydration made defensive groups incapable of combat for several days. Engineers then managed to approach and seal the cave and tunnel entrances without a major battle. Radio intercepts became several pages of horror. Commanders asked for permission to kill motionless soldiers who could no longer move. Utilitarian requests in conditions of food shortage. But higher command rejected such requests. The reports carried a new tone. We are facing an enemy of another kind. He does not defend territory. He kills our ability to live. The Marine Engineering Group brought reports that the cave entrances were often weakly guarded, and that it was enough to fill them with smoke or block the ventilation so that sick and exhausted soldiers came out choking and were either captured or disappeared trying to survive. By the end of the campaign, the Americans moved to the final phase, called in the text surgical reduction. Not a full blockade, but step-by-step neutralization of remaining points, again without large losses of live force on either side. Reports indicate that with such methods, American losses were minimal, sometimes 3 wounded per week, whereas Japanese garrisons burned out, mainly from disease and hunger. The Bushido Code, which preached death in battle for honor, proved powerless before a slow, humiliating death from sickness and exhaustion. Many Japanese preferred suicide to enduring this kind of demise, described in documents as non-warrior. In March 1943, a test example was carried out, the reduction of a powerful fortified object, in the text Fort Dato, a multi-level cave system where engineers applied 3-step logic. First, they destroyed the water sources around the fort by clogging, redirecting streams, or salting. Then conducted a psychological operation, set up loudspeakers broadcasting messages that supply would not come and hope was gone. The third stage used methods aimed at ventilation and sanitation systems of the caves, not explosions, but the use of smoke and chemicals irritating the respiratory tracts and increasing the suffering of the already sick. The result? Inside the fort, mass collapses began. people lost consciousness, begged for sorties to find water, but were met by fire or trapped. Such a sequence allowed reducing the attackers' losses to zero, while simultaneously rendering hundreds of defenders combat incapable. After the campaign, Operation Anvil entered post-war analysis as an example of using logistics and medicine, respiratory support, water, disease prevention as key factors of victory. American hospitals reported that most Japanese casualties died not from gunfire but from dehydration, uncontrolled dysentery, and malaria. On board hospital ships, there were cases when Japanese prisoners initially refused treatment out of shame. Having survived under disgraceful circumstances, they felt they had lost honor. These psychological consequences affected the Americans as well. Soldiers who participated in patrols and destruction of resources suffered moral strain and turned to chaplains for help, as it was hard for them to watch men slowly die of hunger and disease, and at the same time understand that it reduced their own losses. Thus, Operation Anvil demonstrated not only tactical efficiency, but also ethical ambiguity. Post-war legal reviews confirmed that deliberate deprivation of supply directed solely at a military target in the absence of civilians and without committing widespread crimes was considered a lawful military measure. Nevertheless, the moral weight was another account. Soldiers admitted that victory in this form left an inner wound in both survivors and victors. The Japanese reports noted that the very fact that soldiers preferred to die from a bullet rather than from disease and hunger reflected the collapse of their notions of honorable death. In the general summary remain dry figures. The campaign lasted 251 days. Of several tens of thousands of defenders, only a small number survived. A significant proportion of losses were attributed precisely to disease and exhaustion, not to combat. The colossal advantage of the American industrial machine in its ability to continuously deliver water, medicine, food, and sanitary means proved to be a weapon far more effective than armor or artillery. And the main conclusion was that, in the industrial era, war is often decided not in trenches, but in docks and factories, in pumping stations and warehouses. He who can supply can wait. He who waits wins. In the post-war years, Operation Anvil became an example for further strategies, influencing methods of counterinsurgency and economic pressure. Officers who studied the campaign noted that blockade of key supply lines and destruction of sanitary infrastructure could be the decisive factor in conflicts against static entrenched forces. At the same time, veterans of both sides gathered at meetings and discussed the impossibility of a celebration of victory. The Japanese acknowledged the technological might of the enemy. The Americans began to think about the price such victory demanded. Years later, at joint veteran meetings, many shared a feeling of respect and at the same time shame. Respect for what people endured, and shame that they died not in battle, but from the lack of simple things, water and medicine. And it was precisely this ambiguity, a victory that saved thousands of American lives, but brought slow, humiliating death to thousands of defenders, that remained the main moral heavy legacy of the campaign. On the island, which in the text is later renamed Riku Island, traces of those events are still found. Pits, caves, dilapidated fortifications. The island became a reminder that sometimes the most terrible force is not the projectile, but its absence. The absence of a bag of rice. The absence of clean water. The absence of a tablet of quinine. And the story of Kamoshima Konoshima showed that modern industrial war can transform resources into weapons no worse than gunpowder, and that logistics and sanitation are not secondary directions but the core of struggle.